They said this horse was hopeless, and so why did one old cowboy bet everything he had to save it? They called the horse hopeless before the gavel ever fell. No papers, no future. Just another problem, headed for a quiet end. But in the back of that dusty auction barn stood a man who knew what it felt like to be written off while still breathing. And when he raised his hand, he didn't just buy a broken horse. He made a choice that would cost him everything, and give him something he never expected. The auction barn squatted at the edge of the San Juan Basin like a tired animal that had learned to endure the wind. It was early winter, the kind that crept into your bones without asking permission, carrying dust instead of snow. Inside, the air smelled of old hay, diesel, and stale coffee, practical smells, the kind that belonged to transactions, not mercy. The metal pens rang with nervous movement as hooves struck steel, each clang echoing off the rafters. At the far end, under a flickering sodium light, a gray horse stood alone. They had written hopeless in block letters on the tag wired to the pen. The horse's coat was a dull ash, darker along the neck where sweat had dried and dried again. Its ribs showed when it shifted, not dramatically, just enough to tell the truth. Every few minutes it lifted its head too quickly, as if startled by a memory no one else could see, and knocked its forehead against the rail. Not hard enough to break skin, hard enough to make a point. A handler leaned on the fence nearby, chewing gum, watching with the bored vigilance of someone waiting out a storm. "Dead-end horse," he muttered to no one in particular. "Can't load it, can't touch it, won't last." The auctioneer's voice boomed through the loudspeakers, practiced and unkindly efficient. Lot numbers rolled forward like calendar pages torn away. Calves, mares, old geldings with good teeth and bad hips. Each one reduced to a price, a pause, a gavel strike. The crowd shifted, jackets creaking, boots scuffing the concrete. Ranchers, traders, a couple of buyers from out of state who talked quietly about fuel costs and transport insurance, about margins thin as wire. This was business. This was rural property changing hands in winter, where survival depended on math more than sentiment. When the gray horse's turn came, the room cooled by a degree. "Lot 79, the auctioneer announced, clearing his throat. "Grade horse, age uncertain, no papers." A ripple of disinterest passed through the bleachers. No papers meant no pedigree, no resale value, no future that could be insured or leveraged against a loan. "Behavior issues," he added, glancing toward the pen as the horse flinched at the sound of his voice. "Sold as is." A few heads shook. Someone laughed once, sharp and brief. Another voice called out, "Meat price?" The auctioneer nodded, already adjusting his expectations. The bidding opened low, dipped lower, stalled. The gray horse rocked its weight from one foreleg to the other, breathing fast, eyes rolled just enough to show the whites. It wasn't aggression. Anyone who knew the difference could see that. It was something else, defense worn thin by repetition. At the back of the barn, half shadowed by a stack of empty pallets, Jonah Reed stood with his hands buried in the pockets of his coat. He hadn't meant to come today. He told himself that as if it mattered. He had driven out of habit, out of a need to be somewhere loud enough to drown the quiet waiting back at his trailer. Since his wife died, silence had become a weight with edges. The radio didn't help. Neither did sleep. He came to places like this because the noise was honest. Jonah watched the gray horse without moving. He didn't see a problem to solve or a bargain to chase. He saw a body that had learned the cost of motion. When the horse lifted its head and struck the rail again, Jonah felt it in his own neck, a sympathetic tightening that surprised him. He shifted his stance, boots finding a crack in the concrete, and breathed out slowly. The bidding crawled on. Numbers fell away. The auctioneer's cadence flattened, impatient. "Any advance?" he asked, scanning the room. The gray horse paused its rocking. For a moment, just a moment, it went still. Its gaze drifted across faces that did not look back, then landed unexpectedly on Jonah. The eye that met his was dark and steady. There was no plea in it, no fire, just a kind of exhausted attention, as if the animal had learned that panic wasted energy it no longer had to spare. Jonah felt something inside him tilt the way a compass needle swings when it finds north. He thought of medical bills stacked on his kitchen table, of the old truck that rattled when it climbed the grade, of the small business he ran out of a toolbox, and a battered anvil. He thought of his son's last text, practical, distant, careful, and of the empty chair across from him at night. "Last call," the auctioneer said. The gavel lifted. Jonah raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't step forward or clear his throat. He simply lifted his arm, elbow stiff from the cold, palm open. A few people turned. Someone snorted. The auctioneer squinted, recalculating. "We've got a bid," he said, surprised enough to sound it. The number he named was small, sensible, almost insulting in its modesty. The gavel fell. The sound was final, clean. The gray horse startled, then froze, as if waiting for the blow that usually followed endings like that. It didn't come. Jonah lowered his hand and felt the weight of the room settle back into itself. He hadn't planned beyond the moment. He hadn't considered transport, veterinary care, the line items that would soon demand answers. He only knew that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. As the auctioneer moved on, Jonah stayed where he was, eyes still on the pen. The handler approached, keys jangling, and glanced at Jonah with something like disbelief. "You sure about this?" he asked. Jonah nodded once. His voice came out steady when he answered. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." And as the handler reached for the latch, the gray horse shifted its weight again, the quiet between them stretching thin, just long enough for Jonah to understand that whatever came next would not be simple and would not be quick, and would change more than he could afford to lose. The handler swung the gate open, and the gray horse's head snapped toward the sound like a door had been slammed inside its skull. Its nostrils flared, pulling in the barn air as if it might taste danger. The boy, maybe 20, cheeks raw from wind, kept one hand on the latch and the other on a short lead stick he didn't quite know how to use. He glanced at Jonah again, searching for the moment the old man would admit he'd made a mistake. Jonah didn't. He walked down the aisle at an unhurried pace, boots steady on concrete, and stopped outside the pen without leaning in. He'd learned long ago, working under horses with sharp heels and quick tempers, that confidence didn't come from force. It came from consistency, same breath, same posture, same hands. He kept his shoulders loose and his gaze low, not challenging, not pleading. The horse rocked once, then twice, the muscles along its neck twitching under the dull coat. A faint scar cut through the hair near the throat latch, half hidden, like an old line the body had decided to keep. Jonah noticed it and filed it away, the way he filed away the smallest changes in a hoof wall or the faint hitch in a stride. This wasn't the first frightened animal he'd seen. It was just the first one in a long time that made him feel like he was looking at something familiar. The handler swung a rope halter over the top rail and winced as the horse flinched from the motion. "We can try to run it through the alley," he offered. "Get it into your trailer quick." Jonah shook his head. "No alley." The boy's eyebrows climbed. "Sir, it won't let anyone touch it." Jonah's voice stayed quiet, but it carried. "Then nobody touches it." For a second, the handler looked like he might argue. Then he shrugged the way people do when they've never lost anything that mattered and can't imagine why someone else would. He stepped back, giving Jonah room, and watched like he was settling in for entertainment. Jonah opened the pen gate just wide enough to slip through and latched it behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut was clean and final, and the horse stiffened as if that noise alone could summon old harm. Jonah didn't move toward it. He stopped near the entry, turned slightly sideways, and let his hands hang loose at his sides. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, slow enough that his ribcage softened. His farrier's hands, knuckled, scarred, nails trimmed short, stayed visible. Empty. Minutes passed. The barn shifted around them, a cough in the bleachers, the scrape of a boot, the auctioneer's voice fading into the next transaction. Jonah didn't look up. He watched the horse's shoulder, the small changes in weight that said more than a scream ever could. When the horse's ear flicked toward him, he didn't reward it with movement. He simply stayed. The first time Jonah spoke, it wasn't for the horse, it was for himself, like testing whether his voice still belonged to him. "Easy," he said, barely louder than the wind outside. "You don't have to do anything right now." The horse's breathing hitched, then steadied. Its eyes stayed on him, dark and watchful, not trusting, but listening. Jonah took one slow step, not forward, but sideways, widening his angle, giving the animal space to choose. He crouched, picked up a handful of shavings, and let them fall through his fingers. It was a small sound, soft as rain on dry ground. The horse's head lowered a fraction, then rose again, uncertain. He reached into his coat and pulled out something he hadn't intended to use today. A worn apple, forgotten in a pocket from the last stop on his route. He rolled it gently across the shavings so it came to rest near the horse's forefeet. The horse startled, then stared at it like it might explode. Jonah didn't push. He backed his weight onto his heels and waited. Eventually, so slowly it felt like the barn itself was holding its breath, the horse stretched its neck toward the apple. The movement looked careful, like every inch of motion carried a memory of pain. It sniffed, then stopped, head trembling, as if the act of reaching had cost too much. Jonah saw the tremor and felt something tighten behind his own eyes. Not anger, not pity, recognition. Because Jonah knew what it meant to measure every movement against what it would take from you. After his wife Claire got sick, he'd learned to move through life the same way. Careful steps, controlled breathing, the constant calculation of how much strength he could spend a day and still have something left for tomorrow. The last year of her life had been an exhausting economy. Hospital parking receipts, pharmacy lines, insurance phone calls that held him in a loop of polite voices and fine print. He'd sat at the kitchen table with medical bills stacked like small tombstones, doing math with a shaking hand, deciding which payments could be late without shutting off the heat. Claire had been brave in a way that made Jonah feel both proud and powerless. She'd still laughed sometimes, even when she couldn't keep food down. She'd still asked him about his day, like she wasn't the one carrying the heavier burden. When she died, the house didn't just get quiet. It got hollow. Jonah's work kept him moving, miles of highway, ranch roads, dusty driveways, but the moment he shut his trailer door at night, the silence came back like something living. And his son Lucas had tried. Jonah knew that. Lucas had shown up after the funeral, stayed a few weeks, fixed a leaky faucet, cooked meals neither of them tasted. But Lucas was a man built for forward motion. He couldn't survive inside Jonah's grief without drowning in it. Eventually he left, taking a job in Phoenix, promising to call more and calling less as months passed. Jonah never blamed him out loud. He just learned how to live around that absence too. In the pen, the gray horse turned its head away from the apple and rocked again, faster, a shiver traveling down its body. Jonah didn't reach out. He simply shifted his feet, grounded himself, and spoke low. "I'm not going to trap you," he said. "Not today." He let the minutes do their work. When the horse finally lowered its head and took a tentative bite of the apple, one crunch, then another. Jonah didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He only exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for years. Outside the pen, the handler muttered under his breath, "Well, I'll be—" Jonah lifted the rope halter slowly, not raising it above shoulder height. The horse's ears pinned for a second, then flicked forward, uncertain. Jonah didn't approach the head. He moved to the side, toward the shoulder, and held the rope out like an offering that could be refused. He waited until the horse's breathing slowed again. When he finally stepped closer, it wasn't to claim, it was to ask. The horse froze when the halter brushed its neck, muscles turning to stone. Jonah paused instantly, hands still, pressure gone. "That's it," he murmured. "You're doing fine." He tried again, a fraction at a time, until the halter rested loosely in place. The horse didn't fight. It didn't surrender either. It simply stood, waiting for the part where it got hurt. Jonah swallowed hard. "Not here," he said, as if making a vow the animal could hear through bone and blood. "Not with me." Getting out of the barn took longer than anyone expected. Jonah didn't march the horse down the alley. He didn't swing the rope, didn't snap commands. He walked one step, then waited. Another step, then waited again. Each time the horse balked, Jonah let it stop. Each time it trembled, Jonah softened his posture until the tremor eased. By the time they reached the loading yard, most of the crowd had already moved on to the next spectacle. The cold outside was sharper, the wind carrying grit that stung Jonah's cheeks. His trailer, a battered two-horse stock with a dented fender, sat parked beside a newer rig that looked like it belonged to someone who still believed in upgrades and futures. The gray horse stared into the open trailer like it was the mouth of something that had swallowed it before. Jonah didn't pull. He stepped into the trailer himself, boots thudding on the wood floor, and stood inside as if it were just another stall. He held the lead rope with slack, not tension, and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that forcing a moment only makes it break. The horse leaned forward, sniffed the ramp, then jerked back, neck twitching, eyes wide. Jonah saw the way it guarded a certain angle of movement, how it refused to turn its head too far, how it trembled when the wind hit the side of its neck. A detail, a warning, a story. He lowered his voice until it was almost swallowed by the wind. "Come on," he said. "One step, that's all. One step, and we're done for today." The horse stood there, trembling, making the decision the way a frightened soul makes any decision, by measuring the pain of going forward against the pain of staying where it was. Jonah waited, and the cold crept deeper into his coat, into his knees, into the old ache in his hands. He didn't move first. He refused to be the reason the horse remembered something terrible. At last the gray horse lifted one hoof and set it on the ramp, then another. Its body shook as it climbed, each movement careful, brittle. When it finally stepped inside the trailer, Jonah felt something in his chest unclench so fast it almost hurt. He didn't slam the door. He closed it gently, like sealing a promise. The handler, watching from the yard, spat into the dirt and shook his head. "You're either the kindest man I've seen," he called, "or the dumbest." Jonah didn't answer. He climbed into his truck, hands steady on the wheel, and started the engine. The trailer rocked once as the horse shifted inside. Jonah listened to that movement as if it were a heartbeat. He pulled onto the highway with the wind at his side and the desert widening ahead, and for the first time in a long time, the silence waiting at home didn't feel empty. It felt like it might have a reason. The highway unspooled ahead of Jonah like a pale ribbon under a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Clouds thinned and thickened, the sun flashing through in brief, blinding shards that turned the windshield into a mirror. He kept his speed steady, one hand light on the wheel, the other resting near the radio without touching it. Behind him, the trailer swayed in a slow, patient rhythm. Each movement carried through the frame of the truck and into Jonah's spine, a reminder that he was no longer alone with his thoughts. He didn't speak. Not because he thought words would spook the horse, but because he didn't trust his own voice yet. There was a habit to being quiet that had grown deep roots. When Claire was sick, Jonah learned how silence could be a kind of mercy, how it could make space for breathing, for pain to pass without being examined to death. He'd learned, too, how silence could become a wall if you leaned on it too long. A gust of crosswind rattled the trailer. Jonah eased the wheel and listened. The sound from behind was controlled now. No frantic scrambling, no hollow thuds against metal. Just weight shifting, measured and cautious. He pictured the gray horse standing inside, legs braced, head low, deciding how much of itself to give to this motion. Jonah felt the echo of that calculation in his own body. He had lived years like that, one careful choice at a time, conserving what little certainty he had left. The turnoff to his place came up fast. A dirt road cut away from the highway, narrow and rutted, bordered by scrub and juniper that bent low to the ground like they'd learned not to argue with the wind. Jonah slowed and took it gently, letting the truck idle over the washboard surface. Dust rose and settled. The trailer followed without complaint. His place wasn't much. A single wide trailer set back from the road, a small corral he'd patched and repatched, a shed that held his tools, and an anvil worn smooth from decades of work. He parked beside the corral and shut off the engine. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. For a moment he stayed where he was, hands still on the wheel, breathing in the smell of dust and hot metal. When he stepped out, the wind hit his face clean and cold. He walked to the trailer and unlatched the door with care. He didn't fling it open. He eased it inch by inch until light spilled inside and touched the gray coat within. The horse stood braced, head angled away, as if the open space itself were a test it hadn't agreed to take. Jonah stepped back and waited. The horse didn't rush. It didn't bolt. It stood there, breathing, eyes flicking between the open door and Jonah's boots. Jonah shifted his weight and turned his body slightly, an invitation without pressure. He kept the lead slack. He thought about the first time he'd come home to an empty house after Claire died, how the doorway had looked wrong without her voice calling out, how he'd stood there longer than necessary, not quite ready to cross the threshold. The horse took one step, then another. Its hooves hit dirt, and it paused as if surprised by the feel of ground that didn't slide or ring. Jonah felt his shoulders loosen. He didn't touch the horse. He let it stand, let it smell the air, let it decide that nothing was chasing it out here. The corral gate creaked when Jonah opened it. The sound made the horse flinch, a sharp, full-body recoil that traveled from neck to tail. Jonah froze instantly. He saw the way the horse guarded a certain turn of its head, the way its muscles locked when the wind brushed one side of its neck. This wasn't simple fear. It was memory, layered on top of pain. "All right," Jonah said quietly, not soothing so much as honest. "We'll go slow." Inside the corral, the ground was soft with sand he'd hauled in himself years ago for a mare with bad feet. The horse stepped in and stopped, ears flicking, eyes wide, but not wild. Jonah closed the gate behind them and leaned against the fence, giving the animal room. He watched the horse's breathing settle, watched the tremor ease from its legs. For a long time they just stood there. The light shifted as afternoon slid toward evening. Shadows stretched. The horse began to move in small circles, careful arcs that avoided a certain angle. Jonah tracked those movements without staring, the way he did when assessing a horse's gait for a client. There it was again, the hesitation, the guarded turn, the slight hitch when the head came up too fast. A pattern. Jonah felt a tightening in his chest, not fear this time, but understanding. He knew what it was like to protect a wound so thoroughly that the protection became its own cage. After Claire's diagnosis, he'd done that with his heart, kept it wrapped so tight he could barely feel it beat. The days blurred together then, each one measured by appointments and medication schedules, by what he could fix and what he couldn't. When she was gone, the habit stayed. Guarding became automatic. The horse stopped near the fence, close enough that Jonah could see the fine scars along its neck, the dullness where hair had never quite grown back right. He didn't reach out. He didn't need to. The recognition passed between them without touch. Jonah went to the shed and came back with a bucket of water and a flake of hay. He set them down and stepped away. The horse eyed the hay, then Jonah, then the open space beyond the fence. Jonah stayed still. When the horse finally lowered its head to eat, it did so with its body angled away, an old habit of survival. Jonah let it be. As the sun dropped, the desert cooled fast. Jonah pulled his jacket tighter and leaned on the fence. He thought about Lucas then, about how his son had learned to read people quickly, to decide whether a situation was worth staying in. Lucas had inherited Claire's practical streak, her ability to cut through noise. Jonah wondered what he would say when he told him about the horse. He could already hear the pause on the other end of the line, the careful questions, the worry disguised as logic. "Later," Jonah murmured to himself. Not a promise, a delay. The horse finished the hay and lifted its head. Its eye caught the light, reflecting gold for a second before darkening again. It looked at Jonah, not through him, not past him, but at him, steady and unblinking. Jonah felt the pull of that gaze, like a hand closing around something fragile. "I see you," he said, not loud enough to carry beyond the fence. The horse took a step closer, not toward Jonah's hands, but toward his space. It stopped there, breathing slow, ears forward. Jonah didn't move. He let the moment settle, let it be exactly what it was without naming it. Dusk came on fully then, the sky turning the color of old steel. Jonah fetched a lantern and hung it on the fence, its light soft and steady. The horse startled at first, then adjusted, the way living things do when they're given time. Jonah sat on an overturned bucket and rested his elbows on his knees. For the first time since the auction, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd done, the bills, the uncertainty, the long road ahead that didn't come with guarantees or applause. He thought of the handler's words, kind or dumb, and found that neither fit quite right. What he felt instead was a strange, quiet alignment, like something in him had clicked back into place. The horse shifted closer again, close enough that Jonah could feel its warmth through the cool air. It didn't touch him. It didn't need to. The space between them narrowed until it felt deliberate. Jonah exhaled and smiled once, brief and private. "All right," he said. "We'll figure it out." The horse's ear flicked toward his voice, and for a moment the reflection in its eye looked less like fear and more like attention. Jonah held that image gently, knowing better than to rush it, knowing that mirrors only work if you're willing to see what they show you. Morning came without ceremony. No bird song, no gentle light, just a pale strip of dawn pushing against the desert sky, washing the land in a colorless calm. Jonah woke on the narrow bed in his trailer with the ache of cold settled deep in his joints. For a moment, he didn't remember why the silence felt different. Then he heard it. A soft, uneven scrape of hoof against sand outside, steady but restrained. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the chill. The gray horse stood in the corral, head lowered, tracing slow arcs along the fence line. Not pacing, measuring. Jonah leaned on the fence and watched without interruption, the way he'd learned to watch storms roll in, alert but not alarmed. The horse stopped when it noticed him, ears tipping forward, eyes dark and unreadable. There was no greeting, no fear spike, just awareness. Jonah nodded once as if acknowledging an equal. "Morning," he said. He fetched water, then grain, measured carefully, aware of how little margin he had left. The feed store invoice sat folded on his counter inside, numbers he hadn't looked at yet, because looking would make them real. He set the bucket down and stepped back. The horse approached, cautious but not retreating, and began to eat. Jonah noted how it kept its head low, how it shifted its weight away from one side when the wind gusted. More pieces of a puzzle he hadn't agreed to solve, but was already solving anyway. After breakfast, Jonah did what he always did when life threatened to tilt too far in one direction. He went to work. A ranch 10 miles south had called about a gelding throwing a shoe. Jonah loaded his tools into the truck, glanced once at the corral, and hesitated. Leaving felt wrong. Staying felt impossible. He settled on a compromise. He set up the corral so the horse could see the road, the open space, the sky. Then he left, telling himself it was only for a few hours. The job took longer than expected. A cracked hoof, an owner who hovered, questions about costs. Jonah answered patiently, hands steady, mind elsewhere. When he finally drove back, dust trailing him like a wake, his chest tightened at the sight of his place, still standing quiet against the horizon. The horse was still there, standing, waiting. Jonah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He unloaded nothing, did nothing dramatic. He simply leaned on the fence again and shared the space. That was when the weight of the decision began to settle, not the emotional part, but the practical one, the math, the timeline, the reality that quiet choices still came with invoices attached. That afternoon, Jonah called a local veterinarian, not a specialist, just someone to look. The vet arrived in a dusty pickup, boots caked with dried mud, eyes sharp and kind in equal measure. He didn't rush. He watched the horse move, asked Jonah to walk it in slow lines, paid attention to what wasn't happening as much as what was. "Something's not right," the vet said finally, voice low. "Not behavior. Pain. Neck maybe. Neurological involvement." Jonah felt the words land like stones dropped into water. No splash, just depth. "Can you fix it?" he asked. The vet shook his head slightly. "I can tell you more after tests, but fixing, that's a longer conversation." After the truck drove away, Jonah stood alone by the corral, hands curled around the top rail. The horse stood a few yards off, watching him. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows that stretched and overlapped, binding the space together. Jonah thought about the word hopeless again. How easily it was used, how final it sounded, how wrong it often was. He went inside and unfolded the feed store invoice, then the electric bill, then the notice from the bank reminding him, politely, about his dwindling cushion. He laid them side by side on the table like cards in a hand he hadn't chosen to play. He didn't curse. He didn't pray. He simply looked until the numbers stopped swimming. When he went back out, the horse had moved closer to the fence, close enough now that Jonah could see the faint scar near its throat clearly, the way the hair grew unevenly around it. He rested his forearms on the rail and met the horse's gaze. "This is the part where most people quit," Jonah said, not accusing, not sad, just stating a fact. "They look at the cost and decide it's too much." The horse shifted, ears flicking, but didn't turn away. Jonah straightened slowly. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with clarity or courage. It arrived the way most real choices do, quietly, without witnesses, already half made by the time you noticed it. He went to the shed and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages of contacts, notes, old numbers. He circled one, then another. As night fell, Jonah made the calls he'd been avoiding. To the feed store, to the vet again, to a farrier friend who still owed him a favor. Each conversation cost him something, pride, comfort, certainty, but he paid anyway. When he hung up the last time, the sky was full dark, stars sharp and unforgiving. The horse stood at the fence, closer than before. Jonah opened the gate and stepped inside, careful, deliberate. He didn't reach out. He just stood there, sharing the cold, the quiet, the risk. After a long moment, the horse leaned its weight slightly toward him, not touching, but choosing proximity. Jonah swallowed. "All right," he said again, softer now. "We'll see it through." He stayed there until the stars shifted and the cold bit deeper, until the quiet choice he'd made settled into his bones like something permanent. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that didn't announce itself. It wasn't progress in the way people like to count. No dramatic breakthroughs, no clear markers to point at and say, "This is when it changed." It was quieter than that. Jonah woke before sunrise, brewed coffee strong enough to bite, and stepped outside while the desert still held the night's cold in its pockets. The gray horse stood where it always did at first light, angled toward the open land, listening. Jonah stopped trying to do anything. He set a chair near the corral and sat with his coffee cooling in his hands. He read invoices aloud sometimes, not for the horse, not really, but to keep his own mind from spiraling. He spoke about fuel prices and weather forecasts, about a client's stubborn gelding, and the way the anvil rang different depending on where you struck it. He spoke the way he used to talk to Claire when she was too tired to answer, not filling the silence, sharing it. The horse began to map Jonah's presence. It learned the sound of his boots on gravel, the difference between his working clothes and his coat. It learned that his hand stayed low and open, that his voice didn't sharpen when it hesitated. The corral became less of a boundary and more of a suggestion. Distance shrank by inches that mattered. One afternoon, a gust of wind rattled the shed door hard enough to bang it shut. The horse flinched, head snapping up, body coiling to flee. Jonah didn't move toward it. He moved away, taking pressure with him. He waited until the horse's breathing slowed, until the tremor eased. Only then did he step back into the space they shared. That was when Jonah saw it clearly, the way the horse guarded its neck, how certain movements lit a fuse he couldn't see but could feel. He adjusted everything around that truth. He fed from the side that kept the horse comfortable. He placed water where the horse didn't have to crane. He stopped asking for turns that pulled too far. It wasn't training. It was accommodation. At night, Jonah slept lightly. He dreamed of hands closing around nothing, of voices calling from rooms he couldn't enter. He woke with the old ache in his joints and the newer one in his chest. Sometimes he lay there listening to the wind until it felt like an answer. Midweek, Lucas called. The phone buzzed on the counter while Jonah was cutting baling twine. He stared at it longer than necessary before answering. "Hey," he said. There was a pause on the other end, the familiar gathering of words. "Dad, I heard you bought a horse." Jonah leaned against the counter. Word travels fast. "Is it true?" Lucas asked. Not accusatory, careful. "It's here," Jonah said. "Yeah." Another pause. "You okay?" Jonah looked out the window at the corral, where the horse stood in partial shade, watching the fence line as if it were learning a new language. "I will be," he said. It was the truest answer he had. They talked around the edges, about work, about weather, about nothing important. Jonah didn't explain. Lucas didn't push. When they hung up, Jonah felt both lighter and more exposed, like he'd opened a door he wasn't ready to walk through. The following day, Jonah brought the anvil closer to the corral and began working there. He shaped steel with slow, even blows, letting the sound settle into the space. The horse startled at first, then steadied. Jonah watched the ear flicks, the way attention replaced fear when the pattern became predictable. He remembered Claire watching him work once, years ago, saying she liked the way he listened to metal as if it talked back. Late afternoon, Jonah set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his jeans. The horse had drifted closer without Jonah noticing, close enough that he could see the fine dust clinging to its whiskers. Jonah held still. He didn't reach. He didn't breathe deeper. He let the moment choose its own shape. The horse extended its nose, not to touch Jonah, but to test the air near his sleeve. Jonah felt the warmth, the soft pull of breath. He swallowed and stayed exactly where he was. When the horse withdrew, Jonah didn't follow. He smiled once, small and private. That night, the vet called back with more information. Nothing definitive yet. More tests would mean more money. Jonah listened, asked questions, wrote numbers on the back of an envelope. When he hung up, he sat at the table with the envelope and the quiet, and made another adjustment, to his expectations, to his life. He circled a date on the calendar and didn't write why. The horse shifted in the corral, hooves whispering over sand. Jonah stepped outside and leaned on the fence. "We'll go at your pace," he said, not because the horse needed to hear it, but because he did. "I've rushed enough things in my life." The horse turned its head slightly, careful, thoughtful. Jonah felt the mirror again, not just in fear or exhaustion, but in patience learned the hard way. He stayed there until the light thinned and the desert cooled, until time itself seemed to slow to match them. It began with a sound Jonah couldn't place at first, not a crash or a spook, but a low, strained exhale that didn't belong to the wind. He heard it while rinsing his coffee mug at the sink, a faint groan carried across the yard like a secret slipping out. Jonah set the mug down and stepped outside. The horse stood near the fence, head angled awkwardly, jaw tight. Its breathing came shallow and uneven, each rise of the chest careful, measured. When Jonah shifted his weight, the horse startled, not away, but inward, locking its body as if motion itself had turned dangerous. Jonah felt the old farrier's instinct kick in, the one that noticed what didn't match. This wasn't fear responding to noise, this was pain responding to movement. He approached the fence slowly and stopped short of entering the corral. "Easy," he said. Not to calm, but to announce himself. The horse tried to lift its head higher and failed halfway through, the motion arrested by something invisible. A tremor rippled down its neck, and Jonah's stomach tightened. The vet came later that afternoon, earlier than expected, dust trailing his truck like a warning. He didn't bring reassurances. He brought patience and a bag that looked heavier than it should have been. Jonah watched from the fence as the vet worked, his movements careful, his eyes never leaving the horse's neck and poll. He asked Jonah to lead the horse a few steps, then stop. A few more. Stop again. "There," the vet said quietly when the horse balked at a simple turn. "That's not attitude." He explained it slowly without drama. Possible nerve involvement, likely old trauma, the kind that settles into bone and doesn't announce itself until the body can't compensate anymore. He talked about imaging and specialists and cost that stacked up faster than Jonah wanted to hear. He didn't say hopeless. He didn't say fixable either. Jonah nodded and listened, the way he had learned to listen to doctors once before. He asked the questions that mattered. What hurts? What helps? What makes it worse? The vet answered honestly. When he left, he did so with a look that carried more respect than pity. Jonah stayed by the fence after the truck disappeared, hands gripping the rail until the wood pressed back. The horse stood still now, the earlier strain easing into something quieter, but no less real. Jonah thought of labels again, how easily they stuck, how rarely they told the whole story. Behavior issue, problem horse, words that saved time and shifted responsibility. He went inside and pulled the calendar off the wall. He circled another date, then another, the ink heavy and final. He made calls he'd been avoiding, about imaging, about payment plans, about whether anyone still remembered the favors he'd banked years ago. Each conversation cost him something, but none as much as walking away would have. That night the pain came back hard. The horse paced in short, tight steps, stopping and starting like it couldn't find a safe place inside its own body. Jonah didn't try to restrain it. He opened the gate and stood just inside the corral, not blocking, not pushing. He kept his hands visible and his voice low, a steady line through the dark. The horse pressed its head toward the fence and held it there, forehead resting against the wood. Jonah recognized the gesture from a lifetime of animals and from nights beside a hospital bed, seeking pressure, seeking relief. His chest tightened. "Okay," he murmured, "I'm here." He fetched a folded towel, clean and thick, and wedged it gently between the horse's head and the fence, easing the angle without forcing a change. The horse exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that sounded like surrender and trust tangled together. Jonah stayed with it until the pacing stopped and the night settled again. Later, sitting at the table with the lamp turned low, Jonah stared at the numbers he'd written earlier. They didn't add up in any direction that made sense. He thought of Lucas, of the life his son was building that had room for clean lines and fewer risks. Jonah understood that life. He just didn't live in it anymore. He stepped back outside before bed. The stars were sharp and indifferent, the desert stretching away like an answer that didn't care if you asked the right question. The horse stood quietly now, head lower, eyes soft but tired. Jonah leaned on the fence and let the truth settle. "You're not broken," he said, not as comfort, but as fact. "You're hurt." The horse shifted its weight and turned its head slightly toward him, careful, deliberate. Jonah felt the mirror again, not of fear or patience this time, but of endurance, of carrying pain without spectacle, of being mislabeled because it was easier for everyone else. He stood there until the cold crept into his boots and the night claimed the edges of the world. Tomorrow would bring decisions that couldn't be softened with time alone, but for now the label had cracked, and beneath it something real had finally been named. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It crept in over several mornings, disguised as routine, hiding inside small adjustments Jonah made without announcing them to himself. He moved money from one envelope to another. He delayed a repair he'd promised himself he'd do before winter set in. He circled dates on the calendar and then crossed them out, replacing them with others that carried more weight and less certainty. The first real collision came when Lucas drove in unannounced. Jonah heard the unfamiliar engine before he saw the truck, newer than anything that belonged on this stretch of dirt road. By the time Jonah stepped out of the shed, Lucas was already climbing down, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the corral with a look that mixed concern and disbelief. He didn't say hello right away. He just watched the gray horse standing near the fence, head held carefully low, body angled as if protecting something fragile. "So it's real," Lucas said finally. Jonah nodded. "It's real." They stood side by side, the silence between them thick but not hostile. Lucas broke it first. "Dad, the vet called me." Jonah exhaled slowly. He'd known that would happen. The vet had probably felt it was kinder coming from someone else. "Then you know," Jonah said. "I know it's bad," Lucas replied, "and I know what that kind of care costs." He turned to face Jonah fully now. "You don't have that kind of money." Jonah didn't argue. "I didn't say I did." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, frustration leaking through his controlled tone. "Then what are you doing?" Jonah looked past him, out toward the desert where the land flattened into distance. "I'm not doing nothing." The words landed harder than Jonah intended. Lucas stiffened. "That's not an answer. You can't just bleed yourself dry for a horse that might never—" "That's enough," Jonah said quietly. Lucas stopped, surprised not by the words, but by the calm behind them. Jonah wasn't defensive. He wasn't pleading. He was settled in a way Lucas hadn't seen in years. "I'm not choosing this because it's smart," Jonah continued. "I'm choosing it because I know what it is to be written off when you're still alive." Lucas looked at the horse again. It stood still, ears flicking toward their voices, not panicked, not relaxed, just present. "Dad," Lucas said, softer now, "you lost Mom because you kept fighting things you couldn't control. I'm not losing you too." Jonah felt the old ache stir, deep and familiar. He took a step closer to his son. "I didn't lose your mother because I fought," he said. "I lost her because sometimes fighting isn't enough. That doesn't mean you stop fighting the next time." They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. The argument lived in the space between them, heavy with years of unspoken grief. Lucas turned away first, jaw tight. "How?" he asked. "How are you going to pay for this?" Jonah didn't answer immediately. He walked to the truck, opened the door, and reached behind the seat. He pulled out a small leather pouch and set it on the hood. Lucas recognized it instantly. "You're not serious," Lucas said. Inside the pouch was Jonah's last real asset, the custom tools he'd had made decades ago when his work still took him to bigger places, when his hands were steadier and his future wider. He'd kept them not because he needed them, but because they reminded him of who he had been. "I can replace tools," Jonah said. "I can't replace time." Lucas stared at the pouch like it might bite him. "Those are your livelihood." Jonah shook his head. "They were. What I do now doesn't require them." The words carried more truth than Jonah had expected. He realized, standing there, that his work had already changed. It had narrowed, deepened, turned inward. He wasn't losing something. He was shedding it. Lucas didn't respond. He walked a few steps away, then stopped, shoulders rising and falling. When he turned back, his eyes were wet but steady. "You're asking me to watch you gamble everything," he said. "I'm asking you to watch me choose something," Jonah replied. "There's a difference." That night, after Lucas left without saying goodbye, Jonah sat alone in the trailer with the leather pouch open on the table. He touched each tool once, then closed it and set it aside. The decision felt heavier than fear and lighter than regret. The next morning, Jonah drove into town. He sold what he needed to sell. He didn't bargain hard. He didn't explain. He came home with an envelope that felt too thin for what it represented and too thick for the quiet it bought. When he stepped back into the yard, the horse lifted its head and watched him. Jonah crossed to the corral and leaned on the fence, exhaustion settling into his bones. "This is the part nobody applauds," he said under his breath. The horse took a step closer, then another, stopping just short of contact. Jonah didn't move. He didn't reach. He let the choice stand on its own, unadorned and irreversible. Later that afternoon, Jonah made the call that locked everything into place. Appointments were scheduled, transport arranged, numbers committed. There would be no turning back without consequence now. As dusk fell, Jonah stood in the corral, the air cooling fast. The horse shifted its weight, and for the first time leaned, not away, not into the fence, but subtly toward Jonah's shoulder. The contact was brief, tentative, but unmistakable. Jonah closed his eyes. He had done the unthinkable. Not because he believed it would save the horse for sure, but because he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. The trip to the clinic began before dawn, not because Jonah wanted a head start, but because the desert was kinder in the hours before the sun remembered its strength. He drove with the headlights low and steady, hands light on the wheel, listening to the rhythm behind him. The trailer didn't sway much. Whatever medication the vet had given the horse was doing its quiet work, smoothing the sharp edges without stealing awareness. They arrived without ceremony. No crowds, no drama, just a low building tucked against the edge of town and a staff that moved with the efficient calm of people who had learned not to waste energy on fear. Jonah signed papers he barely read, trusting the questions he'd already asked more than the fine print. When they led the horse away, Jonah didn't follow. He stood in the parking lot and watched the sky lighten, the first pale streaks cutting through the dark like a promise that didn't need witnesses. The hours stretched. Jonah sat on a bench that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. He didn't scroll his phone, he didn't pace. He let time do what it always did, pass whether he approved or not. When Lucas arrived mid-morning, he didn't announce himself. He sat down beside Jonah and handed him a cup of coffee without a word. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The bond between them, strained and reknotted over years, found a quieter tension here. When the veterinarian finally came out, she spoke plainly. The injury was worse than they'd hoped, but not worse than they'd feared. There were options. None were simple. All required patience. The procedure took the rest of the day. Jonah waited. Lucas waited. Outside, the desert went about its business, indifferent to their vigil. Late in the evening, when the light had thinned to copper and the shadows grew long, they were allowed in. The recovery stall was dim and padded, designed to soften the world. The horse lay on its side, breathing slow, eyes half-lidded. Tubes and monitors hummed quietly, a mechanical counterpoint to the fragile life beneath them. Jonah stepped forward, careful not to rush, and sat on the floor near the horse's head. He didn't speak at first. He simply placed his hand where the neck met the shoulder, warm and solid. The horse stirred, a ripple passing through muscle and bone. Its eye opened wider, confusion flickering like a match struck in the dark. "Easy," Jonah murmured. "I'm here." The horse tried to lift its head and failed, panic flashing sharp and bright. Its breathing quickened, hooves scraping weakly against the mat. Jonah leaned in, close enough for the horse to feel his presence, steady and unafraid. "It's over," he said, though he knew it wasn't, not really. "The worst part's over." He stayed there as the horse's breathing slowed, as the panic ebbed into something softer, more manageable. Outside the stall, Lucas watched through the window, his chest tight with something that wasn't fear anymore. He saw his father, not as a man clinging to a past he couldn't fix, but as someone anchored in the present, doing the only thing that made sense to him. They didn't sleep that night. Jonah stayed until the staff insisted he rest. When he finally stepped outside, the desert night wrapped around him, cool and immense. Stars filled the sky in reckless abundance, each one sharp enough to hurt. Jonah stood there for a long time, breathing, letting the quiet press against him without pushing back. He thought about the path that had led him here, the auction barn, the label, the slow days of waiting, the arguments that cut deeper because they mattered. He thought about Claire, about how she'd once told him that love wasn't proven in the grand gestures, but in the nights you refused to leave. Inside, the horse slept, held together by careful hands and the thin thread of hope Jonah had chosen to follow. When Jonah returned to the stall near dawn, the horse's eye opened again. This time, it found him faster. There was confusion there, and pain, and something else, recognition. Jonah sat and waited, letting the moment settle into its own shape. The horse exhaled, long and uneven, and let its head rest closer to Jonah's knee. Lucas watched from the doorway, the weight of the night settling into his bones. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He understood finally that this wasn't about saving an animal at all. It was about staying when leaving would have been easier. As the sun rose, the desert shifted from silver to gold. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment and let the warmth touch his face. Whatever came next, rehab, setbacks, months that would test the edges of his resolve, this night had already changed something fundamental. The quiet had been earned. Rehabilitation did not announce itself with milestones. It arrived as mornings that felt too early and evenings that came too fast, as rules written in pencil and rewritten daily. Jonah brought the horse home when the clinic cleared them, driving slower than necessary, choosing back roads where the pavement stayed honest. The trailer's air ride hummed softly, cushioning every seam. Jonah listened the way he always did now, with his whole body. At home, the corral had changed. Jonah widened it, softened the footing, moved the water again. He measured angles and distances, like a carpenter rebuilding a house around a single, fragile beam. The horse, still unnamed in Jonah's mouth, though the gray coat answered to him all the same, learned the new boundaries without protest. It moved carefully, choosing economy over speed, the way someone does when they've learned what it costs to be careless. Lucas stayed. At first it was just a few days, then a week. Then long enough that the silence between father and son changed texture. They worked without announcing the work, repairing a fence line, fixing a gate that had sagged for years, laying rubber mats in the shed so the horse could stand without strain. Lucas didn't wear his city jacket anymore. He wore Jonah's old one, the elbows shiny, the cuffs frayed. It fit better than either of them expected. They spoke in small, useful sentences. "Water's low." "I'll get it." "He's favoring the left." "I see it." Sometimes they spoke about nothing at all. Weather, fuel prices, a neighbor's broken tractor. Other times they didn't speak. The work held. The horse learned the sound of Lucas's boots and didn't flinch. It learned the difference between the clink of tools and the hollow ring of metal that meant nothing good. Jonah watched this with a careful pride he didn't name. He had never been good at saying what mattered. He had always been better at making space for it. There were setbacks. Days when the horse's neck stiffened and the old tension crept back. Days when Jonah woke with his jaw clenched and the ledger on the table felt heavier than it should. The bills didn't stop coming. They never did. Jonah paid what he could, when he could. He learned which lights could stay off, which repairs could wait. He learned that dignity could be quiet and still intact. Word traveled anyway. A woman from the next county brought a nervous mare one afternoon, asking if Jonah would look at her. A man stopped by with a gelding that had learned to panic in narrow spaces. Jonah didn't advertise. He didn't promise cures. He offered time and a way of being that didn't demand more than the animal could give. Lucas watched this happen and understood finally that his father wasn't stepping backward into a smaller life. He was stepping sideways into one with a different center. The gray horse began to change in ways that didn't show up on a chart. Its breathing deepened. Its eyes softened. It stood closer to Jonah now without hesitation, and sometimes closer to Lucas too, as if measuring the safety of shared ground. Jonah still didn't rush touch. When it came on the horse's terms, a brief brush of whiskers against denim, a shoulder leaned gently toward a waiting hand. Late one afternoon, a truck rolled up the drive that didn't belong. The man who stepped out wore clean boots and carried himself like someone used to making offers that sounded like solutions. He glanced at the corral, then at Jonah. "Heard you've got a project," he said. "I'm in the market." Jonah didn't bristle. He didn't smile. He listened. The offer was generous enough to pause the air, enough to cover the bills, enough to buy back some comfort Jonah had let go of. Lucas looked at his father, waiting, braced for the old argument to return in a new shape. Jonah shook his head once. "He's not for sale." The man laughed, thinking it was a negotiation. Jonah didn't correct him. He simply stood there, grounded, the way he had learned to stand in hard moments. The truck left dust hanging behind it like a question unanswered. That night, Jonah and Lucas sat on the tailgate and watched the sky change. The horse grazed within sight, head low, movement unhurried. Lucas broke the quiet. "You know," he said, "I used to think you were afraid to let go." Jonah considered that. "Maybe I was," he said. "Maybe I just didn't know what to hold." Lucas nodded. He understood now, not everything had to be fixed. Some things had to be kept. As the stars came on, one by one, Jonah felt the future settle into a shape he could live with. Not bigger, not easier, truer, the kind that didn't need a label to make sense. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It edged its way in, cautious as everything else on Jonah's land. The night stayed cold, but the morning softened, the light lingering a little longer on the sand before climbing away. Jonah noticed it first in the horse's coat, where the dull gray began to show depth again, silver threading through ash like something remembered rather than restored. The place had changed without ever being named. People came quietly. A rancher with an old mare who'd stopped loading. A couple from town whose rescue horse shook whenever doors closed. Jonah never called it a program. He never charged more than he needed to keep the lights on. He told everyone the same thing. There were no guarantees, only patience and rules that bent around pain instead of pushing through it. The gray horse stood at the center of it, not as a lesson, but as proof. Jonah never put a saddle on him. He never asked for more than the horse offered. Some days that meant a slow walk along the fence line, Jonah at his shoulder, Lucas a few steps behind. Other days it meant stillness, standing together while the wind carried dust across the basin like a low tide. The horse learned to trust the shape of Jonah's body, the steadiness of Lucas's voice. Jonah learned that trust didn't need progress to survive. One afternoon, Jonah found the tag from the auction in a drawer he hadn't opened in months. The wire was bent. The ink had faded. Hopeless was still legible, though, the word stubborn in its certainty. Jonah held it for a long moment, then carried it outside and dropped it into the burn barrel. The paper curled and blackened, the word breaking apart before the rest of it did. Lucas watched from the fence. He didn't comment. He didn't need to. Later that week, a letter arrived from the bank. Jonah opened it slowly, the way you open something that might bruise you if you rush. The notice was brief. The terms had changed, not generous but survivable. Jonah sat at the table and did the math twice, then once more to be sure. When he looked up, Lucas was standing in the doorway, reading Jonah's face instead of the paper. "We're okay," Jonah said. Lucas nodded, the relief quiet and contained. "Good." That evening they sat together as the sun slid down behind the low hills. The horse grazed nearby, head low, movement smooth and unhurried. Jonah rested his forearms on the fence, the old ache in his joints still there, but manageable. Pain, he'd learned, didn't have to be erased to be lived with. "You ever regret it?" Lucas asked, not looking at him. Jonah thought of the auction barn, the gavel, the envelope of money that had felt too thin and too heavy at the same time. He thought of the night in the clinic, the breath he'd held until it hurt. He thought of the quiet mornings that followed, the ones that felt earned. "No," he said. "I regret the times I walked away because it was easier." Lucas absorbed that without argument. He reached down and brushed dust from his jeans. "I'm going to stay," he said. Not as a question. Jonah's throat tightened. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "All right," he said. When the light finally thinned to amber, the horse lifted his head and walked over, stopping close enough that Jonah could feel the warmth of him. He didn't lean. He didn't touch. He simply stood there, choosing the space. Jonah closed his eyes and breathed, the moment complete without needing more. People would keep driving past the place. Some would slow, curious about the quiet they couldn't quite name. Others wouldn't notice at all. Jonah didn't mind. He hadn't done this to be seen. He had done it because once, in a barn full of noise and judgment, he'd recognized something the world was done with and refused to agree. The horse lowered his head again and returned to grazing, the scar on his neck catching the last light of day. Jonah watched him, feeling the weight of years settle into something steady. He hadn't saved a symbol. He hadn't fixed a problem. He had stayed. And sometimes, Jonah thought, that was the unthinkable part. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and tell us why. Maybe it reminded you of an animal you once loved, or a time when you chose kindness even when it cost you. Leave a comment below. We read every one. And if you believe that nothing truly living is ever beyond hope, please like this video and subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be told.